In this interview, I am once again joined by Dr. Ben Joffe, anthropologist, occultist, and scholar practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. Ben reveals the industry convention of guru ghostwriting, in which spiritual teachers employ one or a team of writers to produce their dharma books, explains his collaborative process with Dr Nida Chenagtsang on their latest Vajrayana book, and sheds light on his own editorial process. Ben discusses whether a scholar should have practice experience before translating religious texts, considers whether historical inaccuracies in Buddhist scriptures debunk their spiritual value, and raises questions about the origin of Terma treasure texts. Ben also compares the Yuthok Nyinthig retreat format to the Abramelin Ritual of Western occultism, details the signs of success in Tantric practice, and shares Yuthok's promise to appear in bodily form to practitioners with sufficient devotion and attainment. So without further ado, Dr. Ben Joffe. Dr. Ben Joffe, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
I'm so pleased to see you, and so pleased to congratulate you on your latest publication, Foundations of Vajrayana Buddhism, A Guide to Yuthok's Healing Path. And this is a book, it says here, by Nida Chenagtsang, and edited and compiled by yourself. And actually, I would like to start there. You have done a tremendous amount of work over some years on this volume. I think it's very good that in the editor and translator's preface, you lay all that out. And you give a rather detailed description of the work that you did to compile, edit, and indeed compose a lot of this material. This, I think, is a role that, especially in Dharma books of this type, is often not really discussed, not really disclosed. And it's very good indeed, I think, that right at the beginning of the book, you describe it. So can you say a little bit about what your role is in this project and why it is that you decided to detail it so clearly in the editor and translator preface?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I agree with you, Steve, about this is a kind of norm, this style of producing Dharma books. It's kind of a norm in the world of publications by Tibetan teachers. It's kind of been a norm for a while that often there are many hands that produce texts that bear the name of a particular teacher or lineage and so on. So very simply, I work for Sky Press Books as a ghostwriter, translator, and editor. The book is a book of Dr. Nida's teachings, absolutely. But Nida did not sit down and write any of the words in the book himself. The book is a compilation of, if I look at all the sources that I used to create the text from Nida and other traditional Tibetan sources, it spans from the 12th century onwards to the present. And then in the case of Nida's actual teachings, for about 20 years, it's about 20 years of teachings, which Nida has given on the topic of this book, which is the Mundro and Autoguru Yoga sadhana practices of the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition, which we can talk later more about, what that is, the significance and history of the tradition. But basically, the process of creating a text like this is we had a collaborative discussion, Christiana Polites, Nida and I, about the need for a book, a really comprehensive guide on these practices for our students and for anyone interested. And Nida let me know what he wanted to be in the book. And I sat with hours and hours of recordings of Nida's teachings in English. Like I said, given in many different environments, to many different groups of students. I made sure I had very extensive transcripts. Most of the transcripts I produced myself. And then I went through those transcripts and kind of coded and organized them thematically. I also had a number of texts about the Yuthok Nyinthig, about the Yuthok Nyinthig Ngondro practices, Guru Yoga practices that Nida had written in Tibetan over the years, primarily as introductions to Tibetan publications about the tradition. And so those I read and translated. And so kind of what it comes down to in terms of producing a text like this is, oh yes, and then I also had notes and translations that I had made from all the different classes that Nida has given, mostly online in the past few years, that then I was also a part of as a teaching assistant. And so it's kind of, there's a lot of material that goes into that. There's the sort of written corpus of material that I have in front of me as an editor and a compiler. And then I have to say, okay, how do I synthesize and condense? So I take my starting point is always exactly what Nida says. um, and then it's seeing, because there's something really beautiful about having this role is that I get to see a single teacher and how they teach on the same topics and what changes and what remains consistent. And so I'm looking for, okay, well, for the past 20 years, every time a student has asked Nida a question on this topic or this practice, every time Nida has taught on it, he's always had these touch points. And then, you know, I had known him for many years now too, and I was often present in real time in some of these classes as well, or engaging with students or Q&A and discussion. And so that also informs the editorial decision as well. Like I'm not, because of my relationship with Nida, if he says something that he's never said before, I'm not just going to, and I know that's circumstantial or specific to an interaction with a student. I'm not going to overemphasize that unless it's very important. And so throughout this entire process, I'm working with our team. I'm working with Christiana. I'm working with Sarah Faulkner. I'm working with other people who know our Nida's teaching, and I'm working with Nida too, speaking with him, asking him questions whenever I'm unsure about something. Throughout the process of over a year and a half of doing all this, I would touch base with Nida and say, there's an area in your teaching on this topic that felt sort of underdeveloped, or I realized that you hadn't spoken on this, or could you send some voice notes and give some more explanation on that, or I was really confused by this point, or I noticed that there was inconsistency about how one thing was explained in one previous text. And then in terms of this whole idea of the many hands that go into these projects, it's also I have two other things to say on that. So as I explained in my preface, this new book is the original kind of idea for the book was to sort of expand on these two books that both came out in 2013. That I didn't, these books are by Nida also. And I didn't have, also many people were involved in these books too. This is The Tibetan Art of Good Karma, which talks about the Ngondro practices, but much more briefly than in the new book. And this Path of Rainbow Body small text, which is more kind of like lists and diagrams, just sort of contextualizing the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition. So the new book is kind of a synthesis of these two books. It has all the information that was in these two books, but significantly expanded. And some small errors or confusions that were in here were fixed. So these two books also had a number of people involved in their production, and I wasn't around at that time. So I think, as you say, this is very common in sanghas and in Tibetan Buddhist sanghas in particular, that Lamas don't always technically write the books in their name. My personal approach to this is there will be times where Nida will say to me, he will say, you, Ben, write something on this topic, because I feel like people need to understand this. and he trusts me to just it's usually things that are not controversial. So it's, it's like technical information about the meaning of a term or something like that. Of course, there's always a subjective dimension in what you emphasize as an editor or not. But occasionally he'll say to Christiana and I, like, make sure the book has this, do this. And what I do for myself as an editor is I always imagine that any sentence that's produced and that appears in the book, I imagine that someone will subsequently say, hey, Nida didn't say that, or that's not Nida's position. And then I think, have I represented this in such a way that it misrepresents Nida's position? Have I taken something which Nida said at one time, and have I now crystallized it as some grand position when in fact it was really just specific to that time? A key example is that people who've read The Tibetan Art of Good Karma will know that there's some significant discussions about vegetarianism in this book. And at the time, Nida was strictly vegetarian. He is not strictly vegetarian now, and talks about why that is, and his own relation and evolving relationship to his personal diet and health. So if I take, we have to think about how we present certain teachings or positions in light of these kinds of things. So what I do just as a personal process is I make sure that I can explain to myself in this imaginary, these imaginary questions. I make sure I can always say, the reason it says that is because in 2014, when Nida was teaching in Singapore, in the context of this Q&A, this came up, and Nida himself was referencing something that was in a Tibetan text that he's very familiar with, or he was explaining what he was taught by his own teachers in Tibet. So that then leads to the other point I wanted to make. So the first point of the two additional comments was that even the materials I'm drawing on, they themselves were already the work of many hands. But then there's an even more interesting kind of phenomenon around this, is that Buddhist knowledge production is such that, like, I sometimes joke a little glibly that Tibetans have a different traditional idea of plagiarism. Very often you will find texts by authoritative Buddhist commentators that are filled with whole cut and paste passages from other texts, from scriptures, from other revered commentators. And this is not seen as like scandalous or bad. To the contrary, it's, if the content is believed to be positive, true, an accurate representation that's beneficial, then sharing it is good and required. And this idea of authorship is, Buddhism undermines the idea even of an individual self or agent. There's action and not so much an actor. So when you apply that to texts, you also have this more kind of, from a more philosophical vantage point, the relationship to authorship is also different in Buddhism. I mean, that's a slightly different topic, but it's interesting to think about, because I know that Nida sees his teachings as only being possible and as only being a continuation of everything he's learned from his gurus. And from what I know of him, he doesn't have a very proprietary sense of his knowledge. He really sees himself as a medium for Yuthok's teachings and for the spreading of Yuthok's teachings, and isn't very interested, in my experience, in being pedestalized as some grand innovator. He really is just, or big important guru of the lineage. He really wants to share what he sees as the unique value of Yuthok's tradition. So yeah, that's what I could say about that. Very simply though, yeah, my job is to compile, edit, relanguage, synthesize. So it's a lot of organizational work. It's a lot of taking, I do my best to capture some of Nida's voice. There's a lot of you'll notice that there's a lot of Nida often talks in a way that I'm now very familiar with, where he sort of has a tendency to ventriloquize other imagined people when he speaks. He says, some students say, you see a lot of that. Even in the structure of the writing itself, there's quite a lot of um, like multivocality, even in the text, because that's actually how Nida speaks. Of course, anyone who's gone from a transcript of oral speech to the page knows how difficult it is. So much processing has to be done because these are totally different genres of communication. Sometimes you can have a written text that is really close to the original colloquial form. Sometimes it needs quite a bit of reworking. And there's different areas of our publications where things are a little closer or nearer to the really original expression. And sometimes even the desire to stay very close to the oral original can actually lead you astray. Something, there'll be times, on occasion, I get a transcript that I haven't made myself. So I get a transcript in tandem with the recording, and I read the transcript and I think, wow, that feels very strange. Then I listen to Nida saying the line and I realize, oh, I get what he meant. So there's also a way in which if you try too hard to preserve the original oral flavor, you can also mislead people about what the point to be emphasized is. So there's a lot of thinking, and I always check with my colleagues. I have a lot of conversations with them about like, oh, I kept in this particular word that Nida used. Do you think it's appropriate does that make sense in this context as much? There's a part of me that feels like I want to stylistically keep it to capture something of the moment. But then I realize that on the page, it actually, using certain vocabulary or less, or like not first language English speaker modes of expression. And is this capturing something about translating the Tibetan context, or is it more circumstantial? Um, so it's a lot of editorial thinking around these things, but I feel strongly that this represents an accurate and fair distillation of Nida's position on things. Whenever I feel uncertainty about whether that's true, I trust that instinct. I bring it to even longer standing students of Nida's, like Christiana, and I say, does this feel right to you? As having led a Mundro retreat so many times, as having been with Nida in so many situations. Or I say to Nida, do you want this framework? Do you want that? And so we talk about this process, even though the work that I do is often like, I feel incredibly overwhelmed by how much trust my colleagues have in me to sit with this material and work through it. They are always editing, but there are periods of time where, I'll be sitting for several months working on something and then we talk about it. But we're always talking about the editorial process itself. There's always that meta conversation happening. So it's interesting. And you picked up on, I purposefully, consciously wanted to lay that out in the interest of transparency. What materials did I use? What logics guided how this book was made? Because as you've pointed out, many quite famous books by Tibetan Lamas were written according to exactly the same kind of procedures that I'm describing here, but none of that behind the scenes stuff was ever talked about. Like it was a dirty secret, but I don't think it's a dirty secret at all. I think it's a strength. Um, so yeah, that's what I can say about that.
Rumor has it that some famous Dharma books were done in this manner, but perhaps with even more scant resources than you had at your disposal and less access to the teacher, in this case, Dr. Nida Chenagtsang. It is the case, isn't it, that without disclosing that process, one doesn't really know where the original oral teaching ends and the editor's contribution begins. And sometimes it's not that the editor has his or her own hobby horse they want to get in there. Maybe there just wasn't anything about this or that, and they had to fill in the gaps and had to kind of make interpretive leaps, and they didn't understand it themselves, especially some of these high topics expressed in idiosyncratic ways. I'm thinking, for example, of the books of Chogyam Trungpa, which much new vocabulary was coined, lingo, basic goodness, and so on. I'm curious, actually, if you were faced with any thorny issues, any points that you disagreed with what you found in the oral teachings, or you found difficult to reconcile, any idiosyncrasies that you retained because you felt that they actually conveyed something of a special meaning and weren't just the artifacts of oral speech.
I'm trying to think if there's anything in particular that's interesting. I think I've spent enough time with Nida now that there wasn't anything too surprising. I think more generally, what I will say is that, and I've noticed this in myself and also in other Dharma converts, and also other sort of convert practitioners and especially translators, there's sometimes this sort of reaction where this is my sort of attempt to understand a phenomenon. So let me just say that I think a lot of people who get involved in Tibetan Tantric Buddhist stuff, sometimes it's just happenstance that leads them into that, but other times it's like they're drawn to the sort of Byzantine Baroque esoteric quality of Vajrayana. There's a mysterious, sometimes opaque thing to unpack there. Even in my own experience, I recall before I really became directly involved with Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan studies, in South Africa, I encountered some books. I think I encountered a book by Jan Willis about the Chud masters of the Gelugpa lineage. And it was the first time I'd seen Wiley. And I opened this book with these very beautiful evocative line drawings of Mahasiddhas and all the rest. And I was just like, I had read Lobsang Rampa the Third. I had a little more sort of historically grounded knowledge of Tibetan Buddhism, but I just remember being like so overwhelmed. I was like, wow, I don't have the slightest clue what any of these words mean. There's so much jargon. It was also enticingly opaque. And I was just like, wow, I'm so unmoored here. But I also felt this strong, almost like karmic impulse. I was like, I have to know what these words mean. And maybe it was karma, I don't know. But what I do know is that a lot of people, especially those who end up studying Tibetan or studying Tibetan Buddhism in a more kind of like technical way, they put a lot of time and effort into getting grounded, into having the correct interpretation of technical jargon, of wading their way through sectarian histories and politics and the complexities of Tibetan culture and so on. And then I think when there's this reaction, when a teacher says, at essence, this is what this experientially, at essence, this is what this teaching is about. It's actually something very simple and very deep, and it's something anyone can relate to, even without hard-won expertise. And I have noticed that, Nida is the kind of Tibetan teacher who is, I think, exceptionally good at that. I am constantly amazed because often I know what sort of textual sources he's riffing on in a particular moment. I've read them and I know what their flavor is like in the original. And then I see him convey a sort of distilled, accessible version of those teachings to people who you can't read Tibetan or haven't had the opportunity to see the original text and don't know about all the furious debates that scholars have had around this or that. And I've noticed that some people think the reaction is almost like, oh, it's too simple. They'll be like, no, this is like dumbed down, watered down version of this teaching. And for me, it's a very different reaction. I marvel at this. Like, for example, something Nida has started doing more recently in his teaching is he sort of just goes around the room and asks students, how would you translate this term? And it's quite a startling move because we're very used to translators and scholars being these sort of fettered figures. And it's like there's no shortage of Dharma bros arguing with each other in the comments threads about how people misunderstood the nuances of a particular technical term, and they're so wrong and they're damaging the Dharma. And Nida's tendency is to say, what do you feel in your body? What do you, there's something quite democratic about the way he teaches. Increasingly, he started saying, maybe we don't translate Tibetan terms. We don't get sort of fixated on one particular most correct translation, but we create opportunities for everyone, regardless of their level of knowledge or experience. Because like in a way, everyone's qualified to speak on, yes, there's lots of technical knowledge and you need to know how to navigate your way through this. But what are practices like Mundro and Guru Yoga really about? They're not about holding your life and your experiences at arm's length intellectually, filtering them through, you know, intellectual categories, or they're about saying like, how do I experience non-duality? You know, how do I experience my own Buddha nature? How can I feel my way into altruism, compassion? You have to do it from where you're at for yourself. If there was one thing I would say about what sort of marks this book, what distinguishes this book and Nida's teachings is that, and I mentioned this in my preface, like he really again and again emphasizes that people have to feel their way into these practices. I think it's very possible to end up adopting a lot of different ways of approaching it's inevitable because Tibetan Buddhism, as I've often mentioned in our discussions, Tibetan Buddhism is simultaneously Buddhism, a universal dharma, universal truth for all beings, but then it's this indigenous religious, cultural, historical, political traditions that are very linked to like particular places in Tibet, particular families in Tibet. It's like, and so if these teachings are going to have meaning for students broadly, they're also going to have to localize and feel their way into these things. And it's going to happen anyway. I think we need both, you know. We need really rigorous debate, or we need translation committees. We need highly skilled academic understanding. But what is all this translation work for? Translation operates on many levels. You know, like why I feel good about this book is on one level because like I worked hard to translate some primary sources in Tibetan that hadn't been shared before that can really contextualize the unique qualities of the Yuthok Nyinthig, really make people appreciate how it operates. So I'm proud of having done that work, but I'm also happy about the fact that this book, I think, in sum, will encourage people to ask themselves like, am I really relating to these practices, not as an exotic, often obscure, maybe even alienating set of foreign practices that I'm now trying to get close to, but in terms of like, what's my life? What do they say about who I am? What I really why what's all this for? What are my values? How do I suffer? How do I what what does this mean for me? Like one of the, in my opinion, most defining features of Vajrayana as a form of Buddhist practice is that it's deeply idiosyncratic. Everybody has to find a way in which the practices make sense for them as the entirely unique person that they are. So I see value, obviously, because of the type of role I play. I see value in both those poles, if you want to put it that way. Yeah.
I have one more process question before we get to the contents of the book. And, one often hears this idea, this term, scholar practitioner. And that's, in some quarters, a bit of an oxymoron. How can a scholar really be a practitioner? Aren't the two, this is perhaps an older idea, isn't religious devotion and scholarly objectivity, won't they inevitably clash, I suspect? I suspect that they must occasionally clash, and then one will subordinate to the other. Maybe that's what determines the scholar practitioner over the practitioner scholar, who knows? In any case, but then there are other ideas that actually, without some first-hand experience of practices, in this case, you may be missing important context, detail, understanding, and so on, and that somebody producing a work like this ought to, if not fully immerse themselves, if not attain the highest reaches of the path described within text like this, should at least, I don't know, do what? I mean, what's the minimum? So I'm curious what you think of this scholar practitioner idea. If, as I suspect you will say, a scholar ought to have some practice, how much practice is necessary, and how far should one have gone before one can write about Dzogchen and Mahamudra? If you haven't done Yungundro and so on and so forth, how do those things interact?
Yeah, a few thoughts on that. The first thing that popped to mind is that there's actually a Tibetan term for scholar practitioner. I've never seen people mention this, but there is. It's a kind of standard common term, kito. Someone who's knowledgeable as a scholar, has knowledge that's cultivated through scholarship, and drup as someone who's accomplished spiritually. And this in Tibetan language is a pre-existing, already hyphenated term. It's sort of understood to be like the norm in a way. So of course, I think what most people mean when they say scholar practitioner is they're actually talking about something slightly different. They're talking about etic versus emic perspectives. Because you could argue that in the Tibetan context, the scholar part is not like, scholarship doesn't mean adopting a position necessarily from like outside of the worldview, or system that you're in. So that was one thing that came to mind. Yeah, I like, as you were talking, I was thinking, which side am I on? But I'm not, it would be tempting to say, well, because of my anthropological training, I obviously tend more towards the yes, you have to have some kind of practice experience, some sort of insider perspective. Yeah, I would say that, but I don't think I really have a side, because I experience all these things myself. I don't think it's as neat as that. It's not like a neat choice. What I can say is that even since I first started working with Nida until now, as a result of spending more time with these primary sources, and especially in the context of practicing them, but also just studying them and translating them, I now understand so much more about the unique flavor of the tradition, the terms of reference. I genuinely don't think this is the thing I think people don't really understand. Even the most genius native Tibetan translator, scholar, practitioner isn't necessarily going to be steeped in the particularities of every lineage. That's impossible. And they're not always going to be able to see. Now that I've read many prayers associated with the Yuthok Nyinthig lineage written by masters from many lineages, now that I've looked more closely at the Yuthok Nyinthig as a whole cycle, it's very clear to me what there are particular terms, particular emphases that get repeated. Like, people are engaging with a tradition that has its own particularities that are much, much clearer to me. And I won't claim there's a part in the text. Maybe I'll read my translation of it. Let me just find it for you. There's a part in the text where in one of his historical chronicles, Sumton Yeshe um, uh, the heart disciple, the closest disciple, Yuthok's closest disciple, he explains how he was given the teachings of the Yuthok Nyinthig. So I won't read the whole thing, but he says, then he, Yuthok the Younger, gave me practice instructions based on his own experience. That's my translation of this term, nyamti, for each of the practices, one by one, leaving out no oral instruction for any of them. So he's saying, he told me what the sadhanas and practices were based on his own experience of doing them. And then I asked him more questions about particularities of the procedure, and he explained further. And then he says, by relying on these, the highest meditative experience arose. And henceforth I, Jnanadhari, that's the Sanskrit version of Yeshe his name, I too, like Yuthok, seized the citadel, the fortress, he says, Tsensa. So this is a very common Ati Yoga Dzogchen metaphor where he says to seize the fortress. It's like it's a very aggressive metaphor. It's like but it's also a pun. When you seize something, you apprehend it, you grasp it. This throne in the center of the citadel this fortress is the realm, the kingdom of the Dharma Dhatu, of the ultimate reality. So I do not claim that I have seized the throne on the taken over the citadel of ultimate reality of truth. But what I can tell you is that the Yuthok Nyinthig itself is a product of a student sitting with a teacher, being given instructions about practice based on that teacher's, very explicitly based on a kind of encapsulation of that teacher's direct experience, and then living with that teacher, getting to know them, then practicing in their own way, according to their own obstacles and opportunities and strengths and weaknesses, and then experiencing the results for themselves. So that is how the Yuthok Nyinthig came to be as a corpus of teachings. And you feel that when you read the text, it has that quality. So I'm not claiming that I, have seized the citadel, but I don't know it feels like it would be bad faith of me to try to do it any other way. Like right before finishing the first initial draft of the book, I went to Pure Land's newer center in Tuscany and had the great opportunity to do a Yuthok 7-day Ngundro retreat in a group with some people I knew already, some people I didn't know, very new students, very senior students who'd done Yuthok 7-day Ngundro retreat like many, many times. Christiana has done it, I don't even know how many times, and has instructed retreats. And we, I mean, like you just can't understand what these practices mean. Like I had practiced the first time I did Yuthok 7-day Ngundro retreat was in Tibet, when I traveled to Amdo with Dr. Nida in 2016. And I had I didn't really know anything about the Yuthok Nyinthig prior to that. I hadn't really sat and read the text, very limited practice. The first Ngundro practice I'd done in an intensive retreat way like that. And I did that with Christiana as my retreat neighbor in a Ngakpa village. I was very fortunate because now foreigners can't even really travel to that village anymore. It's not even really easy for Nida to go there because of increased Chinese security and surveillance. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity that arose just sort of circumstantially. And then I practiced alone by myself. And I think it did. Maybe I can't say exactly how the book, I don't think the information radically changed because there are definitely things in the part of the book on advice for doing retreat that were informed by my own experiences and by extensive conversations with Christiana about her experience leading retreats and solitary versus group retreat. It's definitely in there. But I just feel on an almost like energetic level that like I know that the material feels like it unlocked for me in a certain way uh, by engagement. It would feel like a weird, willful exercise to not engage. I don't see what value I would get from willfully being like, well, I'm not going to be influenced. The name of the Yuthok by participation, not be influenced by participation. The name of the Yuthok Nyinthig is roughly translated is the blessings, the chinlap of the Guru Yoga sadhanas of the Yuthok Nyinthig, of the hard essence teachings of Yuthok. And this word chinlap is literally means a force, a capacity of one thing to transform another person's mind and experience and body. So the juice, the central juice or engine of the entire set of teachings is this understanding, this notion of a flow of chinlap that one has to allow to enter one. And so trying to maintain a certain positionality, it almost feels like it does go against the idea of being transformed by the practices. At the same time, I'm not dissing the etic view, the alternative distanced view. Like a classic example of this, we don't get into this too much in the book, is this question that has sort of exercised Tibetan and non-Tibetan scholars for many years now. Is Yuthok Nyingma, is Yuthok the Elder, the figure called Yuthok Nyinthig, who from the 8th century, was he real? In the sense of like, can we prove that he existed as a historical personage, or as Tibetan and non-Tibetan scholars? It's not just, this is just so people are clear, this is not like just Western scholars coming in with their filthy scientific materialism, rationalism, Western view. This is also a Tibetan conversation. Tibetans have read the information, the biography of Yuthok the Elder, and they pointed out inconsistencies. They pointed out, you can see it. For example, when you read, there's a really interesting thing. So, as I explained in the book, the biographies, the sort of now kind of classic, standard, well-known biographies of Yuthok the Elder and Yuthok the Younger, come to us from like they're the original source materials, the lineage texts and teachings, maybe from earlier on, but they were commissioned and produced kind of in the same way that I produce texts, by drawing on many different sources, by a very prominent doctor, one of the Dalai Lama's, the 5th Dalai Lama's physicians in like the 18th century. So that's a very far gap from the time of Yuthok, the two Yuthoks. Yuthok the Elder is supposed to be in like the 8th century, and Yuthok the Younger is in the 12th century. So scholars say, oh, we don't have any hard evidence that there was a Yuthok the Elder, and his life seems like such a mirror image of Yuthok the Younger's, that like prominent Tibetan scholars of Tibetan medicine and medical history have said it could be that Yuthok the Elder, his legend was concretized as a kind of backward projection of the Yuthok lineage into the golden age of the Tibetan imperial period. That's kind of the skeptical view. And you see that even in the source materials, like when you read Sumtum's seemingly contemporaneous text, which is filled with direct quotes from Yuthok the Younger from the 12th century, there's one really interesting part which I translate in the book, where Sumtum is asking Yuthok how he produced a miracle, how it was that countless people saw Yuthok make it rain medicine from the sky. And Yuthok says, seriously, you've been living with me for 12 years and you don't understand that I'm realized, that I'm the reincarnation of all these great masters? It sounds a bit, he's a bit harsh with Sumtum sometimes, the tone. And he lists his previous incarnations. Now, again, we don't know. The critical scholar could say, is this just Sumtum saying that Yuthok said this as part of creating a narrative about Yuthok's greatness? Did Yuthok actually say this? We can't say for sure. But we could also say that it's, I believe, other scholars like Bill McGrath had said to me, scholars of Tibetan history, he's like, we don't have any evidence that Sumtum wrote these texts, even that they're from the 12th century. I find it, having looked at these texts very closely, I feel like I know how Sumtum writes. And people in Tibet spoke about engaging with these source materials from the Yuthok's time, these historical materials. So I think it's almost weird to say that there's not enough evidence. It feels almost willfully skeptical. That's a side point. But it's interesting in this text. In Suntun's text, because most of Yuthok the Younger's biography is taken almost verbatim from the materials, the direct quotes and spiritual songs that Suntum records in these texts. And in Suntun's original, let's say 12th century source, he doesn't list, when Yuthok says his previous incarnations, he doesn't mention Yuthok the Elder. But when you read the biography of Yuthok the Younger and you see that exact quote that's been reproduced as coming from Yuthok the Younger's mouth in the official commissioned biography, they've inserted Yuthok the Elder into that list. So that's like a really obvious textual analysis that we can do. And we can, now that still doesn't prove that Yuthok the Elder wasn't a thing. Younger himself says he thinks the tradition, the family history of an elder Yuthok is quite old. He just says we don't have any textual evidence before this time. And Younger himself was a doctor, a great appreciator of Tibetan medicine. He wasn't out there trying to demolish the historical institutions of Tibetan medicine. He was just studying texts and noting what he found. So, yeah, I mean, we can do these exercises. I think there's value in it. Nida and I had more than one conversation about Yuthok the Elder. I said, how much should I get into this scholarly debate about him not being a real historical figure? How important is it? And Nida explained to me his own position, which I put in the book, which is that he knows about these debates, but he also has encountered Yuthok the Elder in visions and dreams. And for him, he feels that he's a very real force. So you'll see that explained in the book. I mean, it's not really, the book is not really about a deep dive into these scholarly issues it's not a scholarly book per se, but I try to signal everything. I try to indicate a lot of different things. And encourage people to feel their way into the material as well. It's good to know what the context, cultural, historical, political context for a lot of this material was. But it's like you're also a person, a practitioner now, who has to, if this is going to have any meaning for your life, you have to translate yourself. You have to, this is why I don't feel unhappy about Nida saying everyone's a translator, because everyone is a translator. Everyone does. People are privately working. When you say cultivate compassion, feel compassion for sentient beings, that's just a word. No one else can feel that for you except you. So in a way, there's always a translation process happening into our own space, time, and bodies. So to me, it just makes sense. But sorry, I don't know if that related to what you were asking. There are definitely these two positions. I'm definitely sympathetic to both. I see the value of both. But for me, practice, absolutely, even in the context of my own engagement with this material, it's changed. I've come to get closer to it, to feel like as a scholar, I understand the context better. As a translator, I'm producing better translations, more grounded, better informed translations over time. And also, I'd be remiss not to mention what I feel very grateful, like blessed to have, which is time with students, getting to meet students from many different backgrounds. talking to me about how what these practices have done for them, or their questions and confusions, like that's also really like powerful and valuable, you know? And it's also part of the story. So yeah.
Your other point about the historicity of Yuthok the Elder, it's quite common, I think, to see this kind of relocation of figures, or sort of accumulation of figures at key narrative points. Certainly in Tibetan history, it's not limited to Tibetan history, and it's usually, as you point out, people find themselves in the imperial period, or they find
It's of
themselves.
so much cultural importance to Tibetan national self-understanding, that period. Yeah.
Right, and in that latter spread, that sort of reconstruction period, 11th century onwards, so there is that tendency to see in those histories a kind of condensation of either acts. In other words, a great historical imperial figure, for example, is acts are attributed to him that maybe were done by other kings either side of him, or so, or indeed people find themselves sort of transported back, or people who didn't live at the same time suddenly are collaborating on some project and so on. So it's not to say that Yuthok the Elder is the only figure.
Not at
There's
all.
a question mark like that. It's not a particularly idiosyncratic question, and I think it's even, as you point out, acknowledged. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm constantly surprised. Maybe I'm saying too much here, but the Blue Annals, for example, was quite a bit of acknowledging of conflicting accounts and inconsistencies and so on. And often Golotzawa will, that's, what is that, 14th century Blue Annals, is it 15th century? He will adjudicate that.
And the medical tradition, the Tibetan medical tradition in particular, has a robust, centuries-long engagement with these questions about textual origins and historicity and influence, because, like, we can talk about this more, but Yuthok's first heart jewel teaching, the Gyushi, the four medical tantras, which are really so important to this day in Soa Rigpa medical education, which this is our previous book, the Dr. Nida's commentary on the root tantra, the first of those four tantras. Even that text is so emblematic of the things that we're talking about, because it's clearly, and Younger did incredible research on this, just textual research also, just saying, like, what can we see when we look at this text? Like, are there other places, are there clear source materials for this, and when are they from? How would they have come to Tibet? How are they connected to certain charismatic translators or teachers? How have they been mythologized? So, like, if you look at the Gyushi, it's deeply indebted to Ayurvedic Indian sources, to particular Ayurvedic texts. There are portions of the text that are clearly just translations of wholesale sections, but there are also portions of the text that are seemingly entirely original and very Tibetan. The text itself frames itself as a revealed scripture that was revealed in the timeless mythic space of Thanadok, the Pure Land of Medicine Buddha. But even in telling that framed story as an introduction, the text also says, when the Medicine Buddha taught all of his human and non-human students throughout all space and time, they heard the medical teachings and received them in the form of all their own traditions, historical, cultural, medical traditions. So it's already a way in which Tibetan doctors are saying, we acknowledge that medicine is plural. We acknowledge that medicine exists across religious, cultural, historical divides, but we are viewing all of this disparate knowledge as having a unifying kind of spiritual origin. And in a way that makes it okay to engage with different medical traditions, which are maybe not Tibetan, maybe not Buddhist, but to see them as being able to be integrated and used. And so that's already a decision. But I mean, the stories one hears about a lot of people today, including Nida, generally fall into the position that the Gyushi as it exists today was a text that was produced, was synthesized by Yuthok and probably a cohort of students in the 12th century. But we know for sure they were drawing on a number of sources. They present it as this timeless thing that arises from a Gnostic source, that's just spoken into being by emanations of the medicine Buddha, having this kind of medical Socratic dialogue. But there is absolutely no denying that this is a textbook. I mean, when you read the Gyushi, it says, if you want to know more about how to apply this technique in this context, see what was written in the previous chapter. It's an organized textbook for use by students and for memorization by students. And there is an account about how Yuthok received a prototype for the text from other teachers, and how it was originally hidden as a terma, but it was discovered as a terma by Drabal Rinshi, another Ngakpa doctor, who was older than Yuthok, maybe one generation prior. And he claims to have extracted from a pillar in Sanye this text, which can be traced to the imperial period. So again, and maybe that's true. I mean, we know that there have been many waves of dissemination of medical knowledge and translation of texts. I think medical texts, foreign medical texts, were being translated even before Buddhism came to Tibet. So there's many stages of this process, and often we talk about authorship, like, okay, who wrote this text? Who translated this text? But we see the many hands involved, even in these texts, that then we're talking about the many people whose work goes into writing modern commentaries on these texts, but the texts themselves are a product of some of these factors. It's really interesting. But in the Tibetan medical context, like, there's lots of conflicting accounts about chronology, about authorship, to whom authorship should be attributed. And it's for that reason that it's interesting, because the Gyushi is not in any of the canonical collections of scripture. It's not in the Kanjur or the Tenjur. It's not recognized as kind of canonical commentary or Buddha, the words of Buddha, even though it presents itself as that. But that hasn't stopped people from valuing it to an extraordinary degree and using it as their kind of primary textbook. So, I mean, medical knowledge has its own category. A lot of scholarship in the last 10, 15 years has really in sort of, especially English language Tibetan studies, has really emphasized this feature of medical commentarial debates about texts and historicity, as if it was something specific to medicine. And I think there's something to that. There is Janak Gyatso has argued that there's a particularly modern medical sensibility. But I increasingly have trouble with that argument, because more and more, the closer we look at Terma, for example, the more we understand how Terma texts have been produced in Tibet, and how Tibetans themselves understand textual corpuses. It's really weird, actually, the way in which Tibetan scholars have just sort of taken unquestioningly the idea that Terma, these vast textual canons that are revealed texts, they sort of just act like they did just pop out of thin air. And they clearly didn't. Tibetans themselves hang out with each other. They look at texts. They take parts of older revelations and suture them together with new ones. They complete portions of a cycle that had been left behind. The Yuthok Nyinthig itself is a fascinating example of this, because, okay, we can get into the question of, is it a terma? What is it? What's its category, genre of text? But one thing we can say undeniably is that it comes from Yuthok's oral transmissions to one student, who then wrote them down and kind of synthesize those oral teachings in written form in direct communication with that teacher. But then down the line, century after century, you've got all these other figures, doctors, yogis, yoginis, who are doing these practices and having visions of Yuthok, adding new material, writing commentaries, reorganizing the text, expanding it, writing supplementary practices and instructions. And this is not like some pearl clutchy thing like, oh no, the pure revelation has been compromised. Yuthok himself says, if you pray to me and follow the instructions I give, I will appear to you and teach you further. So it's almost baked into the system. And this is the same. The more people are increasingly in the past few years, because it's a mammoth undertaking, that's probably why it hasn't been done. But a lot of groups of scholars are starting to look at Terma, and they're starting to say, okay, well, over time, how was this corpus developed? How was it expanded and added to? What are the actual, because you have to read everything. I mean, it's a lot of material, and you have to have good Tibetan knowledge, and you have to understand history and politics and the relationships between these certain and who was doing the practices and what factors influenced which practices were presented to whom and how and why. And then you start to see like these are editorial projects. It doesn't invalidate the idea that they're the product of gnosis, of revelation. It doesn't invalidate that idea at all. It's just that revelation is happening in tandem with all these other factors. Like any text that's produced has to be produced like a text does. There has to be people who are writing it. There has to be a basis on which it's written. Is it dictated? Is it consolidated from many different sources? Like, what are the narratives that, how was it encoded in a spiritual or a more pragmatic sense in earlier texts or yellow scrolls? Western scholars have been weirdly uninterested or almost hesitant to ask the questions you would normally ask of a textual corpus, especially around Terma. They're like, well, it's Terma. It's like they've kind of, I don't know if you agree, but I think that's sort of changing. And weirdly, by choosing to answer those questions, I think you appreciate the material more. It doesn't make you, because I mean, it's incredible. You have to have a very unusual mental capacity, visionary capacity to even just engage with some of this material as an editor in a time before flash drives. And, it's like these are not ordinary editors and minds that are doing some of this work and engaging with these texts. The visionary inspiration and the scholar and the yogi are fully intertwined in these domains. That's why it's possible for people to say, well, the origin of Yuthok's transmissions is like the chakras of his subtle energy body. But he also read widely. He traveled the world, collected medical teachings, learned Indian languages. Like there was this incredible consolidation of knowledge that was happening on many levels. I mean, the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition even teaches a meditative procedure for studying medical texts from a meditative point of view. Now, I should say it very firmly that the medical tradition is very clear. This is not a substitute. This is not like for those people who feel they can't study medicine in the conventional way. Just do the meditation, then you don't have to get a medical degree. No one is saying that, but they're saying, yeah, this is another level in which you can engage with knowledge. And all these things are happening in tandem with each other. Anyway, I spiraled out there a little bit, but you were asking about thoughts on anthropology and textual scholars. I mean, I guess what I would say is if it's good enough if the combining of those approaches is good enough for Tibetan masters, it's good enough for non-Tibetan scholars, to be interested in those different levels of engagement. there was one other thought I had. I can't think of it now. It will maybe return. But yeah, it's just interesting to see these things. These things are also playing out in the Tibetan context too, more than some people are aware of.
It's very interesting what you say about termas, and you ask me if I agree, and I think I do. Rob Mayer's done a great deal, I'm sure you're aware about that,
Yeah.
with Kathy Cantwell, has shown these terms very often part of a team effort with an editorial
Mm.
process over quite some
Mm.
time. And what does that imply about the authenticity and spiritually speaking or soteriologically speaking, etc.? Does that imply anything? Does it debunk anything? Is another question.
I personally, as you can tell from what I just said, I don't think it necessarily does, because I think the visionary encounters and insights have always been present with these procedures. It's just that no one's really paid attention to it in Tibetan studies much. So I don't think like anything's being debunked, because this is how it's always how textual corpuses have always been produced. I also don't think that, and I think a lot of Tibetan virtuoso practitioners live these. Like I said, Kedrup, like there's already a hyphenation of these realities. Like there's amazing instances like even in the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition, a very important figure is Surkawa Nyamye Dorji, who was the founder of the Sur medical school. And from a very young age, he had visions of Yuthok the Younger, and was told in those visions that he was Yuthok's reincarnation. And he did supposedly have incredibly precocious capacity for medicine. He's said to have cured his mother of a life-threatening disease when he was like 4 or 5. Um, and again, this could all be hagiography, who's to say, but he says that, he's literally, and you see this in the life story of people like Dujun Rinpoche. The Dakinis come and they give editorial advice. They say, oh, like that this there's a problem here with how these texts are relating to each other. There's a missing piece. I think in the life of these kind of editor prophets, the divide, the conflict, the tension between these processes of knowledge production, of knowledge, is not so strong. Um, I don't think like Tibetans would be scandalized to know that Turtans, you hear stories about Turtans who are unlettered, and that's part of their authority. That you hear about Serakandro not really knowing how to write. And supposedly, if I recall correctly, Kukuripa, an Indian Mahasiddha, comes to her, and well, she was very close to her. And she says, I can't write down what you just transmitted to me. I don't know to write. So he goes, fop, and hits her on the head really hard, and she wakes up and she could write. So we are told. He says, well, now you can, and do it. Um, so there are these interesting examples of like, and it is a sort of like in-house tantric understanding that letters and words actually come, the ability to write words, the ability to speak is innate in the subtle channels. That actually the shape of Tibetan and Sanskrit letters is an expression of the positive and negative space of the wiring of the tantric energy body. So I think there's a lot of room to accommodate these different modes of knowledge production just in the Tibetan worldview. I think some of the challenges of like, oh, I thought it was a revelation, handed by goddesses in a steaming casket. And now you're telling me it's just a rehashing of other texts and people sitting around and putting it together. I think we're also used to the Bible, honestly. I think a lot of Westerners are more familiar with like critical Bible, historical hermeneutic scholarship being like very at odds with what like native believers are doing. I don't know. I don't think it's quite the same. I think there's still a challenge there, but I don't think it has quite the same charge to it. But I don't know, maybe that remains to be seen. This work is still pretty new.
Well, regardless of whether it's a challenge within the constraints of the tradition or so, it's certainly a challenge to individual believers who, exposed to something like what you just said, may then have to say, well, gosh, it's not what I thought it was. It's not what I was told it was by my Lama or so. And what else am I being misled about, you know? And maybe it's not a malicious misleading. It could just be a ignorance. But then the problem is ignorance is it's a bit of a loaded term when you're attributing it to the things your Lama tells you. But in any case, there are certainly workarounds that accommodate historical realities or historical factors with a more religious relationship to these sorts of sources. There are certainly workarounds, but one does, I think, have to do some work to square the circle somehow, and you have to come up with some way of relating to it.
In Yuthok's tradition, one simple but powerful way in which this is done is to say Yuthok was medicine Buddha in a human form. So in a way, that's inevitable if you're talking about Guru Yoga and the whole mechanics of perceiving in human form, Buddhahood in human, expressed as a human teacher. It's kind of inevitable, but it's also like, then anything that gets said about what medicine Buddha did, it's sort of that synonymity between this human author and this timeless principle. It's easy. You can say, well, Yuthok wrote the text, but as we know, he's inseparable from medicine Buddha, so problem resolved.
Medicine Buddha ex machina does work really well there. But I think there's also plenty of people who were not troubled by such a revelation, if you'll excuse the pun, and will say, well, of course, you know, I don't expect every jot and tittle of a text that's been composed who knows how many centuries ago and come through many recensions and so on. I don't necessarily expect it jot and tittle to have emerged from a dream of or a vision of a Dakini paradise. The point is, does it work? Is it meaningful? Can I relate to it as a mythologically or as a sort of sacred literature in a sense? I mean, there are many different ways of relating to text. It's not for sure that historical analysis debunks or denudes, should we say, all of the value, sacred value to the individual religious practitioner. I mean, it's not guaranteed that way. Anyway, you know, I wanted to shift a bit away from the scholarly reaches, and of course, we're skipping some things here. Who is this Yuthok? What is his Nyinthig? What makes it special and unique? And we've actually covered this in other episodes. I've interviewed Dr. Nida himself about it, and I'll link to that. I'll put a particular link to that signposted there. We've discussed it. You've gone into detail about those things. So I would direct people who want to know about that either to ideally to the book here itself, where you can find out all about that, or to some of the previous episodes in which we've dealt with that directly. I think it would be redundant to go over that again. Of course, one of the special features of Yuthok is makes it very appealing, and Dr. Nida certainly does lead with this, is that we can take a nundro that might require 100,000 repetitions in another context and condense it all into a week. The work of years or months can be done in a week due to a special expediency, and I mean that might be something we can return to in a moment. But you've mentioned something that I thought we'd come to this near the end or not at all, but you've brought it up 2 or 3 times now, which is this idea of Yuthok appearing to somebody who successfully completes one of these week-long practices. And I'll quote here a couple of quotes from your book. And here you're translating Sumtun in his Iron Hook text. And I'll quote here. It says, if individuals with faith practice this sadhana, which is imbued with my very life essence, for 7 days and nights, without distraction, I promise that I will reveal my face thoroughly to them, for the highest practitioners in actuality, for average practitioners during meditative experiences, and for lesser practitioners in dreams and will instruct them and teach them further. And then from Nida's own commentary on this theme, you've written here, the way Yuthok will make himself known to us is variable. Yuthok explains that if we practice with confidence, focus, and genuine feeling, we will meet him in person, in waking life, in visions that arise during meditation, or in our dreams. Yuthok may manifest as a part of nature, during or around the time of our retreat, as a ray of sunlight, or as a rainbow, as wind or rain. He may manifest as a specific animal, to show us or teach us something important in life, and lead us in the right direction. Remember, the fourth type of outer symbolic guru is the guru of all natural sensory phenomena, and the most secret level of Yuthok's body is the great bliss that permeates everything. So Yuthok can appear to us in countless ways. Now, we have had conversations in the past about, as I mentioned, comparing and contrasting European esoteric traditions and Tibetan Tantric esoteric traditions, magical traditions and Tantric traditions and so on and so forth. And I couldn't help but be reminded of this passage from Mathers. And as soon as I say Mathers, you're going to know exactly what I'm going to read you now. And then shall you first be able to put to the test whether you shall have well employed the period of your 6 moons, 6 months, and how well and worthily you shall have laboured in the quest of the wisdom of the Lord. Since you shall see your guardian angel appear unto you in unequalled beauty, who also will converse with you, and speak in words so full of affection and of goodness, and with such sweetness, that no human tongue could express the same. He will animate you unto your great content in the fear of God, making you a recital of the blessings which you've received from God, and bringing unto your remembrance the sins by which you have offended him during the whole period of your life, will instruct you and give unto you the manner in which you shall be able to appease him by a pure, devout, and regulated life, and by honest and meritorious actions, and such things as God shall ordain unto you. After this, he will show unto you the true wisdom and holy magic, and also wherein you have erred in your operation, and how henceforth you should proceed in order to overcome the evil spirits, and finally arrive at your desired ends. He will promise never to abandon you, but to defend and assist you during the whole period of your life, on condition that you shall obey his commands, and that you shall not voluntarily offend your Creator. In one word, you shall be received by him with such affection, that this description which I here give unto you shall appear a mere nothing in comparison. So here we have the promise at the end of a contemplative, devotional Abramelin ritual. I should say perhaps that's from Mather's translation edition of the Abramelin ritual. Something that's come up in this channel quite often. I think we may have even discussed it, you and I, in the past. And at the end of a certain period of operation, some months long, so it's not quite as expedient as Yuthok's version, the Holy Guardian Angel, you'll have contact and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel. At the end of Yuthok's period of 7 days and 7 nights, also an encounter, special encounter is promised. And there are some interesting parallels there. There's some interesting similarities, I think, there. So I wonder if you might say something about this outcome of the Ngundra practice, this encounter with Yuthok. And I wonder what you think of my bringing in this sort of promised outcome, if all goes well, of the Abramelin ritual also.
Well, I think the comparison makes sense. You know, you're not the only person. I have previously, and many other Western occultists have made a comparison between deity yoga, guru yoga in the Vajrayana context and the Abramelin procedure. I think people have slightly different, there's lots of contestation about exactly what the Holy Guardian Angel is, and is it like this other type of entity or spiritual experience? Is it not? I think it's Crowley really sort of formalized this comparative thing. I mean, he was one of the most prominent. He was always making comparisons between, Indian religious traditions, the cultivation of samadhi. It was always part of his own exegesis of the operation to make comparisons with non-Western spiritual traditions. So I don't think we're in good company by continuing to do that. So I just want to say a few things at the outset about the 7-day mundro, and really because it's a 7-day retreat, closed retreat practice in which you do Yuthok specific mundro practices. And I want to point out that all of the commentarial tradition in the Yuthok Nyinthig and Yuthok himself makes very clear that 7 days and nights is the minimum amount of time in which the practitioner can adequately connect with Yuthok and Yuthok's chinlap, his blessings, in order to experience some kind of transformation. When Yuthok says, I will appear to you, again, I want to remind viewers, listeners, that is not like some radical, like, wow, in the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition, in 7 days, you get to have like cool experiences where you connect with the sort of, with like the deep insights of the guru. That's not strange or peculiar. All Yidam practice in Vajrayana, all Guru Yoga practice is supposed to produce those kinds of results. That's kind of the point of all of these practices. No, let me rephrase that. The purpose of these practices is Mahayana Buddhist. The purpose is to experience reality beyond the narrow confines of self-grasping and to cultivate, unconditional, the four immeasurables. But it's very expected and normal that when people do mantra and visualization accumulation retreats for like creation stage sadhanas for the yidam, that the yidam shows their face to the practitioner, that the practitioner is directly blessed by the yidam, that the practitioner draws near to the yidam or the guru and is kind of empowered and granted insight. So I want to sort of I want to point out that there's nothing in Yuthok's tradition which says that like 7 days is it. 7 days is Yuthok makes a promise that 7 days is the minimum amount of time that people need. If people practice with a strong focus and confidence in him and a strong desire to connect with him, 7 nights is enough time. But there's nothing in the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition that says, okay, you should only ever do the retreat for 7 nights. And then at the end of it, you'll be a super powerful realized yogi and you never practice again. Like one of the biggest commentators and advocates for the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition was Jamgon Khyentse Rinpoche, who many listeners will know. He's sort of the key figure in the non-sectarian Rinme movement in the 19th century Eastern Tibet. And, there's many quotations from him that I've translated in the book because he gives quite extensive commentary on Yuthok's Guru Yoga. And, he makes very clear that, like, you should be practicing the Yuthok Nyinthig practices a lot. Like, after retreat, you still do regular, usually daily practice. But, and what I find really fascinating is actually that Sumtum records in his chronicle with all these direct quotes from Yuthok. He asks Yuthok that same question. He's like, how can you be telling me that, like praying to you is so much more powerful and quick in terms of the blessings, the transformative blessings and insights and realizations that ensue? How can you say your Guru sadhana is better than all the others, faster and quicker and more powerful? that doesn't make any sense. You just told me, you've taught me all this time that all gurus have the same nature, that all Buddhas are the same. They have the same mochi, one essence. So Sumtam himself says, well, this doesn't add up. How can what's so special about your practice, your procedure, that in 7 days you're promising all this? It seems to go against like the view. And Yuthok has a very interesting response, which is mentioned in the book. He says, maybe I can actually find the part in the book, but in the meantime, I didn't put the full quote from Yuthok. I paraphrased it because it was quite long, but he talks about aspiration. And so this is an interesting insight into kind of the like Buddhist worldview that's informing this. Yeah. So it says here, that so Sumtam basically questions Yuthok. He says, how can you make distinctions between gurus or yidam, meditational deities, in terms of the extent of their compassion, how compassionate or efficacious they are? How can you say your blessings are so much faster than other gurus, while also teaching that all gurus and meditational deities have the same nature or essence? That, because Yuthok teaches Sumtam, if you practice one guru sadhana, one deity sadhana, you accomplish all yidams. So he says, isn't it inappropriate, Rinpoche, to say that your compassion or blessings are somehow better or superior or higher? So Yuthok's response is, he says, yeah, you're right. The view is that there's no distinction, there's no difference, Cheba, between Buddhas and the extent of their compassion. But he says Buddhas nonetheless help, and he uses the term kagyuwa. They direct or steer non-awakened sentient beings in terms of individual beings' karma and aspirations. The munlam, the aspirations that they made in previous lives. So he says, yeah, it's true that all Buddhas are identical in their ultimate nature and compassionate intention. But he says there's no teaching in Buddhism that says that all Buddhas have to manifest the same way for that reason, that they all have to engage in the same type of activities to help beings, or that all their pure lands are the same. So he's pointing out this unique sort of feature of Mahayana Buddhism. He's reminding Sumtam of it. He's saying it is true that ultimately all meditational deities and gurus have one single nature, and that if you accomplish one sadhana and just focus on that and really get meditative insight from it, then it's like accomplishing all of them. But that doesn't mean that we now don't need many different Buddhas. He says no one Buddha is better or worse than the other, but they still all express themselves with different colors, with different forms. And he says that he then goes on to say it's the same if you read the biographies of the Druptop of the Siddhas. He says all of their biographies are really different. All the Siddhas have different personalities, totally different life circumstances. They all behave and relate to their students in different ways. Some live really long, some are really aggressive, some are really peaceful. But he says in terms of their enlightened view and their motivation, their compassionate motivation, we can't say they're different from each other. So he says to Sumtam, Munlam, prayers of aspiration are what steer all phenomena. There is this idea in Buddhism that we don't even have a perceivable reality separate from the aspiration of beings and Buddhas. That like the world is actually a product, an emanative product of the prior aspirations of beings and of Buddhas. So he says, basically, he says, all beings have their own aspirations, obscurations, and karma, and Buddhas can only guide beings based on that. Different students have to align with the aspirations of different Buddhas. So he basically says to Sumtam, don't complain. This is my promise. This is my bodhisattva aspiration. I saw in the future that there would be beings who wouldn't have the opportunity to have long retreat practice. So I made this promise, and I said that 7 days could be enough time to connect with my blessings, to to open you up to the path. So, and then he says, to finish his little lecture, he says, let the fruits of my aspiration prayer be enjoyed right now. May I liberate all the unliberated. May I free all the unfreed. May all those who are yet burdened breathe a sigh of relief. And this particular positioning that Yuthok gives of himself is also very linked to his status in Tibet as a gumbo, as a protector of beings. Yuthok says he specifically focused on medicine and finding expedient temporary ways to end suffering so that beings could keep going in their practice. So the idea with the 7-day ngondro is not that you're enlightened after 7 days, but it's that that is enough with the right investment in the process to as Konto Rinpoche says, to make a connection, to start to feel the movement of those blessings so that you can then really make progress in your path. Later on, Sumtam asked a follow-up question to Yuthok. He says, but how long will it take to accomplish the Guru Sadhana? You say if you accomplish the Guru yoga practices, then you accomplish all of them. But how long will that actually take? Notice that that's a different question to how long is the retreat or how long is the practice. Yuthok says, our system is built on these 7-day short retreats. I made this aspiration that I would do, I would be available to beings through this mechanism. But then sometimes says, but how long will it take of doing your practices to reach the level of Vajrayana, to become enlightened? And Yuthok has an interesting response. He says, I don't know. How could I know? He said, it all depends on whether beings' karma and aspirations align in a certain way with the practice. And some beings have a lot of obscuration. Some beings have a lot of blockages, outer obstacles, inner obstacles to prevent them from. It could take countless eons for them. But for some beings, it could be really fast. So it's interesting that, like Yuthok's saying, my aspiration, my bodhisattva activity is the activity of quick blessings. But he's not saying that every being is the same and that this practice will be the right practice for every being. I mean, he regularly says, I'm constantly beaming my emanations out like any good Buddha for the benefit of all beings. I'm totally impartial in that. My practices are for everyone, but they won't actually be for everyone. And I think this is not some special take that Yuthok has. I think this is a pretty standard Mahayana understanding that some people just jive with certain Buddhas more than others. Some people click with certain practices. Yuthok says, my aspiration, my commitment as a Buddha is to be fast acting for those who can align with me. But I can't tell you that you will have realizations within any length of time, because that's not how any of this works. So it's interesting to me anyway, from a historical perspective, that Sumtam himself, someone steeped in this context, is asking the same question that students today ask, that I've heard students ask about what does this 7-day procedure mean? And so yeah, we can talk more about the practicalities of how these retreats are done and how they build up, how they're connected to the samaya of the tradition and the expectations that Dr. Nida has and that traditional authorities have about how much you should practice every day once you've done the retreats. As Nida explains in the book, most people are surprised by the 7-day ngondro system because they're familiar with ngondro that is prescribed in terms of number of accumulated practices. But there's always existed in Vajrayana different ways of framing practice. So as Nida explains in the book, there's practice according to time and practice according to signs. And all of the texts of the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition make clear that it's a tradition that works according to signs and according to time. So you practice in these batches of time in order to kind of align with Yuthok's bodhisattva aspiration. And then but the main, what it actually says in the Yuthok Nyinthig, when the Ngondro practices are introduced, is it says, practice for at least 7 days and nights and until signs appear. That is what it says. So I don't want people to get the mistaken idea that there is something special about the 7-day retreat system. It's tied into the mythos, you could say, about Yuthok as a particular bodhisattva. It also has a really beautiful kind of mythic connection to Yuthok's own instructions to Sumtum. When Sumtum goes to Yuthok and he says, I want you to give me your heart essence, oral instructions on Vajrayana. What do I have to do for you to agree to do that? Yuthok says to him, okay, I want you to do 1-week retreats where you accumulate these Ngondro practices. And Sumtum does that. He does 4 1-week retreats back to back. And all the practices he does, except for the Kusali Chön, are there. So in a way, when we redo the 7-day retreat, we're reiterating the original circumstances that produced the teachings of the Yuthok Nyinthig. So it's not just, okay, what do I have to do the Ngondro? I would argue, doing these retreats, you become incorporated into, like in any spiritual tradition, you're reprising there's a history, you're becoming a part of the mythopoetics of the lineage, and that's very powerful in itself. In terms of signs, I just want to point out that it's a very tricky thing to talk about signs connected with practice. That's why we put it at the end of the book, because there is a chapter in the Yuthok Nyinthig that lays out quite systematically some road, like a roadmap for what might be some signs that indicate that the practice has been efficacious, that the blessings have arisen and been transformative. And so I'd like to call attention to what Sumtum records as Yuthok's instruction on what the key gist of the signs of the Ngondro and outer Guru Yoga practice are. So he says, first, the signs for the outer Guru Yoga sadhana and its associated Ngondro practices are as follows. The arising of sadness or disillusionment with samsara, the uncontrollable and spontaneous arising of sadness or disillusion with samsara, with impermanent conditional worldly activities, which then inspires you to turn away from the activities of just this life and to, by implication, commit to more ultimate spiritual goals in a deep way. Devotion for the Guru and 3 jewels arises in a natural, uncontrived way, like an organic way, which makes your mind so much more decisive and single-pointed when you pray, when you do spiritual practice. Yuthok's empowering blessings, transformative blessings, enter into and they allow bliss in your body, positive, blissful, embodied experiences to occur. They make your speech, your mantras, your speech energy potent, and they induce these blessings induce abundant rich mental experiences meditative experiences of bliss, clarity, and non-conceptuality. And then he gives dream signs related to purification, accumulation of merit, which are quite typical of Vajrayana tradition and Ngondro practice. So those signs that are mentioned as being, it might seem very like grandiose, Yuthok appearing to you in dreams and instructing you, but the signs that are a part of doing these practices are really a more genuine, embodied actualization of the basic spiritual principles of Buddhism. Feeling deep gratitude, experiencing interconnectedness with practitioners of the lineage, feeling a sense of inner renunciation, feeling like your practice becomes more spontaneous, deeply heartfelt and natural. That's kind of what everyone's going for in terms of retreat experience. I have met Tibetan and non-Tibetan practitioners who talk about the Yuthok Nyinthig intensive week-long retreats as if they are there to get siddhis, like quickly. And there is that discourse. There is this idea that they're potent practices that are very essentialized, because they're an Ati Yoga Ladu. They're an Ati Yoga Guru Sadhana, where all the three roots, the Guru Deva and Dakini, are condensed into one Guru figure. So people do talk about it like it's a special thing that can be done to generate realization, siddhi. But when you read what Sumtum says about what the kind of signs of progress from doing these practices, these retreats is, they're all the kind of, we could really rephrase that as being, you become a genuinely spiritual person. The basic principles of Mahayana Buddhism become more embodied in you. Yes, you have, and maybe you have some insights in the course of the retreat. Maybe you have some more like meditative experiences, like temporary, momentary feelings of great bliss or selflessness. That's also can be very valuable. But you're really being encouraged to look for signs of purification. And I also want to point out that, even though Nida encourages people to connect with Yuthok's lineage because he believes it's in his power to help people get onto the spiritual path really quickly, at no point is that synonymous with saying, like, do 7 days of mudra and never think of mudra practice again. You either get the magic blessings or you don't, and that's it. It's not really like that. It's part of a more integrated system. The Abramelin operation, I would say, is probably also like that in its broader context of what we know about its broader context. Because it's really about, I think for a lot of secularly raised Western occultists, doing the Abramelin ritual feels like this quite exotic, demanding thing. But several centuries ago, if you were a spiritual person committed to praying to God, committed to mystical truths, many of the things that you do in the Abramelin rite are quite like standard acts of devotion and contemplation. It's maybe the summoning of demons afterwards on that basis is a bit more sorcerous and unusual. And of course, yeah, the Yuthok's tradition also has all these more targeted sadhanas for healers to cultivate specific clairvoyance and siddhis and so on. And this guru yoga is kind of the basis of that. But the idea that a yidam or a guru would appear, that you'd feel a connection, that it would transform your relationship to worldly life, like that, I would say that's pretty standard. I think like Vajrayana historically has tended to emphasize actually practicing according to sign. And it's more common now for the guru to give a kind of big ballpark figure and say, okay, do this many, many thousands of times, because probably by the end of that, that will be enough for the average person. It's kind of like give a large figure. If you're going to accumulate mudra practices according to number, I think that's one way of doing it. But the Yuthok Nyinthig texts are very big on sign, and also very big on the understanding that signs will be radically different for different students, fast, slow. So it's very hard to generalize here. But Yuthok does say this one thing that I pointed out, like, he's like, either you believe, and Control repeats this too. He says, either you believe in Yuthok's specific promise as a bodhisattva, and you try to connect with that, and everything that he sort of embodies in one neat form or package, or you don't. Like so this really is a devotional practice. The last thing I'll say too in that regard is in terms of signs, one of the practices that we do in the lineage is this prayer that Sumtum wrote out of his own devotion. Gankul Sanchama is the name of the prayer. Let me find it. And it's used in many different ways. It's not one of the mudra practices that we kind of do over and over, but it's sort of a preamble. It encapsulates like, let me find there's a new translation of it in the text. So Sumtun is the first verse and the last verse talk a lot about how Yuthok has a most supreme, a most secret body. There's a level of his body which is, well, he explains what it is in the first stanza. He says, homage to the Guru, whose supreme, most secret body is the great bliss, Mahasukha. This is a technical term in Vajrayana. This is unconditional, limitless bliss that's not based on any sort of causative factors. It's the innate, blissful nature of awareness, consciousness itself. He says, homage to the Guru, whose supreme, most secret body, whose body on that most esoteric level, highest level, is one and the same as the great bliss that pervades all matter, all material existence, all things, all phenomena. It is the Vajra Dhatu, which is emptiness endowed with every sublime attribute. So that's my translation of a standard stock phrase in Tibetan, which is like a poetic way of saying the inseparability of form and emptiness, the teaching of the Heart Sutra, emptiness that is simultaneously full of every possible expression, every possible quality. He says, to this incomparable body, which is Yuthok, I prostrate. So when you're doing these Guru Yoga practices, you're constantly reminding yourself that the nature of that you're trying to connect with of Yuthok is that. It's the realization through your own sensory experience of the Buddhist truth of form and emptiness being inseparable. That's the body of the Guru that you're prostrating to. Now, for Sumtum, it was also the physical, historical body of Yuthok the Younger. I've not met him the way that Sumtum met, but when we practice, that's where we're pitching things. So I bring that up because any sign that appears, the goal is to increasingly, organically, genuinely understand that Yuthok is not like just a dead sorcerer who's speaking to us from across the gulf of time. On one level, he is. He's a mighty dead, as Western occultists like to say. He's the soul of a dead sorcerer who modeled something we're trying to accomplish as healers and yogis, yoginis ourselves. But the thing that he's enshrining is the nature of our own, as our own Buddha nature. It's the nature of our own consciousness, which we find for ourselves. And he explains that in a very itemized way to Suntan in his teachings on what is a guru, what is the nature of the guru. So when we say Yuthok can appear as a rainbow, Yuthok can appear as the sound of bird song or as an argument with your friend, that's because in the Mahayana Buddhist understanding, he's always been that because there's an inherent capacity in all sensory arising phenomena to become a guru, i.e., to become the principle which points out the nature of things, to become your teacher. It's just that the promise of the tradition, the Abramelin tradition, the Vajrayana tradition, is that there are some kind of standardized things, which for a lot of people, if you invest in, can kind of quicken that process of experiencing epiphany, of experiencing reality as being divine, as being able to communicate with you. Now, I mean, when you put a traditional state, you asked me, was there anything I was like, well, if I put this in the book in this form, yeah, do I feel uncomfortable about this? Do I want to rephrase this? I did have the thought like, oh, when people read Yuthok's promise, are we now going to get many emails from people saying Yuthok is talking to them and they're now the lineage holder? And I mean, in a sense, I shouldn't be worried about that because one part of me, because the thing that we're trying to connect with in these practices in Mahayana Buddhism is something that's pervasive, that's accessible to all practitioners. It's something that inheres in the nature of being. But then, like even Nida, as a lineage holder of the tradition, he is not telling people that he is like this unique mouthpiece for Yuthok, that he talks about having dreams where Yuthok tells him things as the inner guru, but he doesn't say like, I am the only privileged channel to Yuthok. As the lineage holder, you must listen to me because Yuthok speaks to me especially. So I guess I am aware of the fact that these traditional statements could become a basis on which people might develop what we could say is an unhealthy, inflated sense of their connection to the divine. But I have no control over that. Any single sentence in this text or anything I might say in this interview could also do that. So, yeah, that was one thing I had conversations about. I was like, "Oh, are we going to hear from people now who need to convince us that they are the unique and privileged hotline to great Yuthok?" Um, I don't know. It's an interesting. I'll let you know. I'll let you know what emails or messages I receive. But there's a sense in which there is something very special about this tradition, but the things that it's pointing to and promising are also what Vajrayana Buddhism is sort of, in my perception, is always about. Something is saying, you, my guru, your real body, your truest, most subtle body, is the realization of the Buddhist truth of the inseparability of form and emptiness. That's your body. That's the body to which I pray. That's the reality to which I pray. And that's what we're also trying to connect with when we pray that, say that prayer over as well. That's the level. So on one hand, it can seem like, oh, I've had experiences that are very meaningful for me in the context of retreat. Very simple experiences, just about how I've felt and related to my own sensory arisings that have felt very powerful and blessed, that have I felt have empowered me in a certain way. If I explained them to anybody else, I doubt they would have any kind of meaning. Um, uh, so So I think the question of signs is interesting. Traditionally, you speak with your teacher or retreat instructor if you have questions about uh, how to interpret certain signs, dreams. Mundro is an interesting one because dreams are very important in the context of Mundro because I'm sort of talking like people know what Mundro is. Maybe I should just quickly say.
I think we can. I think we should assume that they do. If they don't, they can Google it, because otherwise we'll never be able to talk about anything other than that.
Yeah. So anyway, with Mundra practices, a lot of the focus is it's much more kind of dualistic. You have a sense in which you're trying to remove veils or obscurations or blockages to being more receptive to your own Buddha nature. You're visualizing gurus and lineage masters beaming blessings into you. It's kind of a much more like, I'm here, I have to do things to better prepare myself to experience something. But all the prayers and all of the practices are very explicit that like there should always be a point, usually at the end of the practice, where you sort of remind yourself that this is an expedient, kind of not entirely true vision of things. There is no impure nature over here that needs the intercession of an external power to purify it. The innate nature is already pure. It's just that we can't recognize that or see it. So we go through these motions, these intensive, visualized, expedient sort of conceptualizations of, and then we sort of dissolve those, like the classic Mundro practice of Vajrasattva, where you have a Buddha embodying the very notion of innate purity, of timeless innate purity. And then you imagine that it's making you pure, that it's removing what is impure. But at the end, all that gets dissolved. And even just for a little instant, you must rest in, Kontrā Rinpoche explains very clearly, you must rest in a state in which there is no purifier, there is no one to be purified. There's no process of purification. So if you can even get that for a millisecond, that's kind of where the practice is meant to take you, where all this effortful conceptual stuff is geared towards. So in the Ngondro, because it kind of has this gradual quality that I'm describing, this sort of, you're at this point and you're trying to get to this point, people do look at your dreams a lot. So some of the signs and dreams that you have in relation to some of the Ngondro practices are not always like nice. And some, in Tibetan sort of dream analysis, there's usually 4 categories of dreams. Dreams that feel and seem bad in terms of their symbolism, but are actually good in their meaning. They indicate like positive progress. Dreams that are good and indicate positive progress. Dreams that are bad and indicate obstacles or blockages or issues. And then, ones that are neutral. They don't necessarily mean, they don't necessarily have like a strong positive or negative quality. So sometimes you can have disturbing dreams, but they are there's some traditional interpretations in the signs of the past teachings of the Yuthok Nyinthig. Like it's in most Tibetan lineages, people say a good sign with Vajrasattva practice, you're actively visualizing kind of gross creepy crawlies and impure body fluids, coming out of your body and transforming into food for afflicted sentient beings. And so if you then have more dreams on a kind of more involuntary, unconscious level of things coming out of your body, of vomiting, of shitting, like that's traditionally in the context of the retreat, people will say that nightmare about diarrhea is actually a positive sign in this context. So signs are all very individual and they're very contextual. So there are traditional roadmaps, but it really depends. So usually, I think everyone can answer for themselves if they feel that there's been some general benefit to doing a 7-day retreat. Like it's made you more motivated about spiritual practice. It's made some of those very core basic teachings of like the common Ngondro about impermanence, about the, valuing your human existence, feeling a sense of meaning in your life, feeling an urge to practice, feeling devotion arise effortlessly. I think most people can say for themselves, well, I do feel like it did something. Something clicked, something changed. I felt it. I've also not felt it. Like different retreat experiences or practices have clicked or not clicked at different moments or different times for me. And then I think the more specific, I think often students sometimes they have those more momentary, like explosive or destabilizing experiences, like bright lights or celestial music, or, like the more the sign, what people think of when they think of meditative science. And then sometimes they can get, it specifically says in the Signs of the Past chapter, don't get attached to those. Don't be too happy or too sad about good or bad signs. Because what you're actually trying to do is to create an inner stability, an inner confidence in your practice that you can keep practicing. So these intensive periods of retreat are really to access to create circumstances in which you're more amenable to the stream of chinlap, which, as I explained, chinlap, this word for bless, usually translated as blessings. It literally means the wave or the current of giving. It's like and it's the idea that like if we could get a little bit outside of our very narrow view of self-clinging, we would see that there's actually a kind of constant, unending, inexhaustible like vibration of blessings. Countless infinite Buddhas in infinite space and time are there available to us, but the hard part is like tuning in. And so retreat gives you this really nice environment, this really purposefully, the word in Tibetan for retreat, tsam, means to draw a line. Tsam means boundary. So it means you're creating like a kind of controlled space in which you cultivate intensively these practices to try to just become more amenable to this sort of continuous stream of blessings. And that really is kind of there all the time. That's the sort of understanding in Mahayana Buddhism. It's really all there all the time, but you're in your own way. And then once you've had that kind of, and the meaning of Jinlap in Tibetan is that it's something which has the power to change another being. And like the dictionary, Tibetan dictionary will say, it's often ascribed to external objects, like, oh, this pilgrimage site, or this icon, or this lama's body, or relics have so much Jinlap. By even just being near them, you can be transformed. But in the actual non-dual tantric understanding, the Jinlap is your own inherent quality. It doesn't exist innately in any external object, but there has to be a kind of coordination, a kind of alignment between our body, speech, and mind and these other like supports, these interdependent connections. And then it's like our ability to trust in and allow to unfold. We have to sort of empty ourselves out a little bit so that we can fill ourselves, so that we can unfold our own qualities. So that's like, so when someone says, yeah, the fifth Dalai Lama said, I didn't change. He said, I fixed the spelling mistakes in the block prints of Yuthok's Auto Guru Yoga Sadhana, but I didn't change anything in the instructions because the Jinlap was so great. I didn't need to be changed. So when Tibetans say, wow, this practice has so much Jinlap, it's like a felt sense that, wow, like with just these simple visualizations can really, like, again, there's no guarantee. Some people, Yuthok himself says, some people will hear my name and it does nothing for them. Some people will hear my name and want to denigrate it. And he says, that doesn't change the fact that my loving, compassionate blessings are just ceaselessly unfolding and available to them. I can't make them connect with me. I can't. Yuthok actually has an interesting quote that he tells to Sumtam. He cites you probably know this quote from I don't know, there's some disagreement about its original textual source, but Tibetan Lamas love it. It's supposed to be from Shakyamuni Buddha, where he says, we sages, we munis, we can't wash away with our own hand the negative karma and the obscurations of beings. We cannot remove the suffering. We can't wash away with water those kind of blockages. We can't remove with our own hands the suffering of beings. We would if we could. All we can do is just point in a direction and hope that other beings sort of orient themselves. That's all of what these practices are. Mundro, Guru Yoga Sadhana. It's all about trying to get you to sort of turn in a direction so that you can have a result for yourself. And it's often, we use these kind of visualizations which are almost misleading. We imagine that they're true and they're not true, because we imagine that all the lineage masters sort of dissolve into the visualized form and they're really there, present, beyond space and time, and all of their support is blessing us. It's a really powerful thing to do. It's kind of ancestral veneration. I've felt the extraordinary potency of like framing my personal practice in those terms. Like, it's not me. I'm opening myself up to the already accomplished like presence of previous masters. It like changes your whole orientation to your practice when you do that. So it's a very powerful thing, but like it's not strictly true in terms of the Buddhist view. It's not strictly true that like we're being beamed down blessings from some outer force. And that's precisely why most Vajrayana sadhanas are actually progressive. So like, just like in many other traditions, the Yuthok Nyinthig has an outer Guru Yoga sadhana. What that means is you're visualizing the Guru. You're starting by visualizing the Guru as if it's very external to you. And then there's an inner Guru Yoga sadhana where your focus, your meditative focus is much more internal in your energy body. Then there's a secret, very esoteric level where you're really starting to work with the dynamic movement of the winds in your channels. And then there's a concise one that sort of consolidates all those mechanisms together in a very essentialized way. And so Yuthok's tradition is unique in that it's already very essentialized in terms of its methods and instructions from the beginning. It's really a Ati Yoga practice. It's the Guru Yoga for an Ati Yoga practice that's very simple, very unelaborated. So, yeah, it's this question of what does Jinlap mean? You can say, oh, I was in the presence of this stupa or this relic, and something happened. It's like my heart. And the conventional way is to say, oh, that was from a master, and they generated blessing power. It's in that physical thing. But it's kind of like it's triggering something that's in you too. So then it raises all these philosophical, practical questions about how important, because then you can go too far in one direction. You can say it's all inside you. It's all the inner gurus. So you don't need any instruction. You don't need any text. You don't need any teachers. You don't need any substances. But then you also see people saying, no, you don't have exactly the right ingredients in the pill. The pill will not transform you if you're not exactly aligned externally. There'll be no internal transformation. I think this pendulum swing, this tension is always there in Vajrayana. At different moments, different masters will say, no, we need more of this. We need to rely more on these external supports and alignments. And then they're like, oops, we went too far. Now we need to redirect ourselves to the inner essence. So, yeah.
It's very interesting hearing you muse about this idea of signs and signs, time, or number being some of the guiding factors of Ngondro. And I'm also holding a book here in my hand, another spiritual exercises of Leola, this Jesuit 30-day retreat manual, which also one of its, if you want, signs is the signs of aspects of that practice is a sense of what in Buddhism you might call renunciation. This, disgust with samsara, disillusionment with samsara, etc. And turning towards, in that case, of course, they call it sort of election. Turning towards God. I mean, this is standard stuff for religious formation.
And then also, just as a little sidebar, if you have signs, you can say, oh, well, the practice clicked for you, there was some transformation. But that doesn't also guarantee that then from that point on, that figure is now, the practitioner is now good. A lot of people have signs, and then it could be because of their karma and their aspirations. And in the Yuthok Nyinthig, we have another level of Ngondro, which is the routine or everyday Ngondro, which is just basic kind of ethics of a socially engaged yogi doctor. It's like you still need to be always doing things like medical charity, healing the sick, repairing roads, saving the lives of animals. Like it doesn't matter how many signs you've had or realizations. There's still a level of spiritual practices, because I think it could be easy. The reason I'm saying this is I've met a lot of Western occultists who are like, oh, I had all the visions, I saw all the spirits and the deities, but I'm like, okay, well, you still don't seem like you have very good daily ethics.
We can think of psychedelic trips as a sort of classic example of that. If you want to see, wonderful things, there's all sorts of things you can take, and chances are you'll see something, experience something wonderful. But then, what is its implication? I think that's a good point. So the reason I brought up, part of the reason I bring up this Abramelin Ritual is we've talked about it before. It's come up on the podcast, and as I said, it has a few similarities with Ngondro. One of them, I think, is this idea of the Yuthok Ngondro, is this idea of an outcome, this establishing of a relationship. Part of the reason that people do the Abramelin Ritual, it seems, is once you've established contact with your holy guardian angel, that's a watershed moment. Certainly it unlocks various magical capacities and so on, but also it gives you a kind of close contact with a spiritual guide in a way going forward. That's sometimes seen that way. And in the Yuthok Nyingthig too, this promise of perhaps having an encounter with a being with whom you might form a special connection. Another similarity, I think, is it can be seen as a bit of a separates the men from the boys in a way. There is that idea that, well, it's almost like you do the Abramelin Ritual because it's like, why do you climb a mountain? Because it's there. You have to do it. And you write about this in your introduction too. You say many students are intimidated, traumatized even, by the prospect of having to repeat Nyingthig practices hundreds of thousands of times. Nyingthig practices are often framed as grueling prerequisites that students have to slog through, arduous formalities which they have to endure before they can move on to other, higher, more advanced practices. Mm-hmm. I've heard non-heritage Buddhist converts speak about Nyingthig like a kind of punishment or a test. I've heard it described as a form of Lama hazing. I've also encountered students who seem to feel that their involvement with apex practices like Mahamudra and Dzogchen obviate the need for Nyingthig, and places them somehow beyond the pale of Nyingthig concerns or procedures. The fact that some students think of Nyingthig as required humiliation or as sanctioned institutional abuse, which they have to participate in to enjoy access to a kind of Tantric Buddhist fraternity system, saddens me. It's all very interesting, isn't it, I think, to think of these sort of psychological aspects of relating to these practices and so on. So to this idea of signs and this idea of the tantalizing encounter with Yuthok, I wonder, in your retreats, in your organization, when you do group retreats together, is there an excitement as the 7 days come to a close? Will we see Yuthok here? Will we see him in a vision? Might we dream about him? Is there an expectation for those signs? Given the promises Yuthok makes, it seems quite reasonable to have, at the very least, a sense of expectation and excitement. And is there some way in which it's formalized that people share their encounters with Yuthok that they think they've had as they come to the end of that week?
I have not personally experienced that as being a strong emphasis. It's not a strong emphasis. What I have experienced is many people do a 1 week retreat and feel that they just want to practice more, either do Nyingthig much more in daily life or do many retreats. We get people who do a retreat once and maybe don't end up spending more time with groups of students or the global Sangha. But the norm, I think, for our Sangha is that people do Nyingthig often. They do these 7-day retreats often. And Nida actually encourages people to try to do 1 a year if possible. And it's very common, our students will repeat the Nyingthig. They often describe it as being a very meaningful, positive time. But there's room for different groups of students organize things slightly differently in terms of how silent the retreat might be over the 7 days, whether there's formalized time to have questions and answers. Sometimes people will mention during those more talkative moments, like dreams that they had. And what I have experienced is that students will kind of, in a non-declarative, non-authoritative way, say, I've also experienced that, or this accords with what I've heard. The usual thing is there is a sort of standard in Tibetan Buddhist context that it's positive to talk about your troubling negative experiences as opposed to bottling them up and not explaining them. It's good to talk about obstacles. It's good to talk about things that have been hard, disturbing dreams, that actually helps process them, talking about them. But that if you have like a dream where Yuthok comes to you and, touches you and blesses you, or that if that feels like a positive, empowering experience, you should usually not tell other people about it. You should only tell your teacher about it if you feel it needs to be interpreted. But otherwise, you should just be grateful for it and keep it to yourself. Because there's also then the risk that once it's out of your hands, it either gets deflated or inflated in ways that can be maybe not so good. So in my limited experience, students will say, I had a dream, if they feel called to, and there'll be some discussion of it. I know, for example, one of our teachers, Drogmo, when she leads retreats on the last day, she has designated time for students to talk about signs, to talk about their dreams. And she gives recommendations and suggestions and and people just get that opportunity because some people do really want to talk about it, often just in the spirit of, because I think you're doing this stuff together, but often because it's quite a quiet retreat, you're not necessarily like in real time being like, are you feeling what I'm feeling right now? You're walking and circumambulating, you're chanting in unison, but very often it's kind of a private experience. So I think it's also cathartic for people to just say, this is what this has meant to me. This has been difficult or easy for me. And Nida invites students who really feel they need dreams or strong signs to be decoded to reach out to him or to speak to us, and we connect them with him. But as you mentioned, he's a traveling Lama who's quite popular. So he doesn't know every student who does a mudra, and he isn't there to to decode every sign, just in his availability. So he always tells students to write these things down so that even much later down the line, because sometimes you find the dreams you had years ago make sense much later. So it's good to have a record of these things, but not necessarily to kind of base the rest of your life on the signs. But it does raise this question, like you're saying, we don't have, because the way our organization works is Nida's really emphasizes a sort of more diffuse, decentralized approach. He likes individual groups of students to kind of proceed as suits them best. And there isn't much or policing around those structures. And when there has been more centralized structuring or planning, it comes with its own problems. So I think it is an interesting question. It's one we have too, about like how much structure, how much, we're also a relatively new organization. Most people are sort of discovering the Ngondro. There's also some interesting like historic cultural questions. Because I mean, as Nida points out, historically in Tibet, almost all of the people who did Yuthok Nyinthig short retreats, whether they be Mundro or some other practice of the cycle, had quite a lot of prior exposure to Buddhism. So many of them already had their own kind of main practices. We see this in the tradition, because the tradition actually says, okay, for this practice, you can visualize yourself as this yidam, which is the in-house yidam of the cycle of teachings, or your own, with the assumption that you already have quite a lot of experience in doing other practices. Also, this is something that comes up a lot. The Yuthok Nyinthig is so connected to Soa Rigpa and training in Soa Rigpa. The reason Nida practices it is because he's a Soa Rigpa, traditional Tibetan doctor, and because his sort of what he's devoted his life to is teaching Soa Rigpa to students around the world. He believes that the Yuthok Nyinthig is of value to people even who aren't studying as Amchi, or to students with varying levels of commitment and engagement to medicine. But the fact remains that most of his students have some even passing interest and connection with traditional Tibetan healing. And because of that, he feels it's especially good for them to connect with this guru, who is the kind of originator of many key Tibetan medical teachings and institutions. And I have heard it said that, yeah, the Yuthok Nyinthig I've heard it said in different guises. I've heard some Tibetan doctors who have very, understandable concerns about the spread of Tibetan knowledge beyond Tibetan communities say that the Yuthok Nyinthig is really guarded. It's not meant to be practiced by even any doctor, any Tibetan doctor, only a doctor of a certain caliber. Then I've also heard it said that the reason the Yuthok Nyinthig has a 7-day mundro is that doctors already have so much merit as a result of sacrificing their life to heal others and practice medicine. They're already so connected to Yuthok because they're studying medicine, his exoteric, non-spiritual teachings, that's why the short retreats work for them. I have not seen anything to support that interpretation in any of the material in the Yuthok Nyinthig tradition, because we need to remember that some of the biggest advocates for the Yuthok Nyinthig were not doctors on their day-to-day. one of the most important figures in the Yuthok Nyinthig preservation and promotion is the fifth Dalai Lama, who loved medicine and studied medicine and supported it, but he didn't practice as a clinician on the day-to-day. And he said that he experienced great results from practicing the Yuthok Nyinthig. So I don't really know where this claim comes from. I've heard some people say, I think somebody said that they'd heard Namkha Norbu say it. I'm not quite sure, but I've heard some teachers express reservations like, if you're not committed to the study of Sowa, then this practice will be inert for you. There is nothing in the tradition itself which says that. I'm going to come out and go out on a limb and say that from what I've seen, what I know. But the fact remains that a lot of students who are practicing with Nida are connected to varying degrees with Tibetan medicine. It's a natural fit for them to do the Vajrayana practices connected with Sowa as they study the more exoteric healing method knowledge. That's kind of how Yuthok designed it. So, yeah, I mean, I bring this up because I think there's a natural way in which people engage with these practices. There's a natural way in which they do mudra in tandem with engaging with other practices. I don't know. I don't think we get a lot of people who just like coming from left field, who hear about this procedure that can give them experiences in 7 days and then do it. In my experience, we don't really find a lot of people like that. We do have people whose first exposure to Vajrayana is Yuthok's teachings, and then they don't stay with the Yuthok Nyinthig, and they go and study with other teachers and do other mudras. This is very common. And then we also have the inverse too. We have people who've done other mudras, and they found that something in Yuthok's practices really resonates for them and makes things fall into place. That's what happened with Nida. Nida was practicing the Longchen Nyingthig, other Nyingma traditions, and then he kind of received transmissions for the Yuthok Nyinthig a bit later, and he felt like it allowed him to understand in a deeper, more experiential way what he had studied before. And he says this is actually a feature of Yuthok's lineage. Yuthok is often described as the one who unifies and integrates. Has an all-in-one, like, essentializing quality. So you hear this a lot. Historically in Tibet, a lot of people find that Yuthok's kind of uniquely essentialized Nyinthig. It's also got a very syncretic quality. His teachings clearly come from a variety of schools of Tibetan Buddhism, Indian sources, Tibetan sources. There's a flavor to it where it seems to help people integrate things. And so that raises the question of what is it like if you use the Yuthok Nyinthig. Like in my case, I haven't practiced much in a deep, extended way outside of this tradition. So it's like that for some of our students. So it raises this question. I think that's the slightly historically unprecedented part. But as far as Nida is concerned, he reads Yuthok's original statements saying he wants to spread his teachings as far and wide as possible to all beings, regardless of whether they even follow the rules or respect him. He really sees Yuthok as being a unifying and very inclusive teacher. So he feels that there isn't any restriction on people engaging in good faith, trying. I think Nida's approach is like, look, it's difficult for a lot of busy lay people to even put aside 7 nights, even though by Tibetan standards, that's a very short retreat, very undemanding retreat, as you say. But if he can get people to even do that, to link up with mudra practices, to even just do that once in their life, Nida's feeling is that that's good. That's going to be good for people, even if it makes them realize, like, wow, this Yuthok Nyinthig or this Vajrayana thing is not for me. That's still a positive. They've still learned something about themselves, And there's less, as you know from your conversations with Nida on the podcast, he's really stressing the fact that it's safer and more grounded for people to do intensive short periods of practice than these long retreats that so often result in lung sickness or instability. So it's like Yuthok specifically prophesies that in the future people would have increasingly worse attention spans, increasingly limited opportunities to do longer retreats. He did say that. But then there's also just this separate reality that we know from that often long retreats can cause problems. So I think for Nida, it's like a mixture of both. It's like he sees this as being sort of part of the aspiration of Yuthok's lineage, and then also pragmatic for a lot of students coming. And for him, it's like, I think another factor was that a lot, and I think we talked about this in a previous conversation, but both inside Tibet and in Tibetan exile for slightly different reasons, tantric training and professionalization and medical professionalization have sort of diverged. There's a lot of different reasons why this has happened in Tibetan Himalayan context. And so Nida also really wants to encourage like Tibetan Himalayan doctors to say like, you can do it. Because a lot of Tibetan doctors will also say, oh, I'm so busy. And, like they also don't really necessarily trust that a 1 week retreat is going to be long enough. Or that like, they're like, well, I don't know the Yuthok Nyinthig. All doctors receive a wang, an empowerment for the Yuthok Nyinthig as part of their graduation in medicine. But not all doctors really intensively engage with the Yuthok Nyinthig. So I think another part of Nida's thinking around promoting these practices is also from the Tibetan, Himalayan, Asian perspective, if even young doctors can just do one retreat for 7 days and connect with the lineage in that symbolic way, that's still really powerful because it's linking them up to this whole other side of Soa Rigpa, which has drifted a little bit away for some practitioners. So I think there's a lot of things going on, but in terms of the practicalities, yeah, I mean, it's we have some students in our Sangha who have done all of Yuthok's practice for a certain period of time. We have like one student I'm thinking of who did a 100-day retreat. This is kind of like the Amdo tradition. It's also quite short by American standards, but it's 100 days of practice. And he did a certain number of days for each level of Yuthok's main practices, each part of the tree of Yuthok's practices. Mundro, all the Guru Yogas, the Kyerim practices, short retreats for all the main Dzogchen practices, and then Mahamudra and Ati Yoga training. So, he continues to do more retreat and more practice. But like, this was something he did in conversation with Dr. Nida, and, that it seemed right for him with the level of his previous experience. And so we have people who've done certain practices that they've very intensively. It's all quite diffuse though. We don't have any. Nida galvanizes a lot of this stuff through his very charismatic, encouraging person. But we don't have a kind of very fixed curriculum right now. And it's not like there's a kind of formal interviewing process or even one single Sangha structure that's an environment for retreats to happen. We have a lot of students who are doing retreats at home. So we have some students who have only connected with Nida via the internet, never in person. I think this is a shift happening in global Tibetan Buddhism that a lot of Sanghas are having to deal with. Increasingly teachers give teachings online, and then what in-person communities are available, what sort of, in America, there's Pure Land Farms, which is a sort of, you visited, you've been there, it's a place where people live, but it's also a place where retreats are hosted and where teachings happen, and it's kind of a permanent space. And then we have Sanghas that are very, very active, like the Singapore Sangha, really dedicated, really active, organizing teachings from Nida, but many other teachers independently, many other Amchi, many other Lamas, but don't necessarily have the same kind of location, like fixed location. And I think Nida encourages students to organize in this way. But yeah, we're very flexible. Some would say permissive about and Nida also has a very relaxed, as is explained very extensively in the book, in the part about the specific samaya of the Yuthok Nyinthig. Nida is maybe a little unusual in this, maybe not. He says, if students receive an empowerment for the Yuthok Nyinthig, he of course wishes that they will practice. But if they find that it's not their practice, then it's not like they're going to hell or they're going to be punished by our organization if they receive the empowerment and then decide to do some other practice. It's not, there's no sort of policing around that kind of thing. So Nida really wants to invite people in to see if they align with these practices and feels that that's okay, that that's in the spirit of what Yuthok himself said. Again, as I said, not everybody, some people are much more, as he acknowledges in the book, the way some lamas talk about samaya, the way they talk about lineage, loyalty, and affiliation is different. So in terms of our organizational structures, I think, yeah, there isn't one model. But this comes through very clearly in the book. I think we all felt it was quite important that there be a discussion of the Yuthok Nyinthig Samaya, what they actually are, what the traditional expectations of how once you've received an empowerment, once you've done certain retreats, what a daily practice would look like. But then also some explanation about what that does and doesn't mean. So there's, I realized at a certain point in writing that it would be good for us to put that in there, and spoke with Christiana and Nida about that a lot. But it's really, students can read this book. They can engage with the practices by themselves. They can then decide as they like to reach out to like a nearby group of students or connect with students online or do further classes with Nida. They can also receive instruction. There's not like a super abundance of lamas out there who are really experientially trained in the Yuthok Nyinthig. It's not like some other lineages, but there are other lamas who give empowerments in Nepal and Tibet. People can connect with them also. It's not, Nida has his own approach to how he teaches these practices. It's not like students have to follow his approach. They could practice the Yuthok Nyinthig another way also. So there's a very particular kind of vibe, a kind of attitude that Nida has, which I think will be abundantly clear in the book, around inviting people into these practices, but also the door is open for them to maybe disengage too,
Certainly there are pros and cons to that more sort of laissez-faire way of doing tantric practice.
Absolutely, yeah.
With against a sort of more institutional or standardized model. I mean, there are pros and cons, aren't there?
Because we have like Lama Justin, who's connected to Nida but has his own lineages, and he is now teaching Yuthok with Dr. Nida's blessing, Yuthok's Ati Yoga practices in a very sort of structured way, and also hosting retreats at his new center. So again, that's a way in which different teachers who've connected with these traditions have different expertise. And to me, it still seems like a lot of these things are unfolding. We don't have a very established, singular, centralized institution around.
That's not the phase your organization's in. The charismatic founder phase is not usually the phase of standardization, institutionalization. If we think about Max Weber or something like that,
Yeah.
So it's not unusual, I think, that you have that somewhat more laissez-faire, as I said, approach to these things. And what an interesting, I've said this to you before, what an interesting moment it is for your group, this team you have, and this comes through in the book. Of course, you have Dr. Nida himself leading the charge, and what a wonderful team he has around him. Christiana, Sarah Fawkes, and others, and of course you, the sort of intellectual powerhouse, producing translations and enormous amounts of materials and that you produce. And in this book is just one of the many things that I know you're working on, and you're always producing such wonderful things. So it's a very exciting collaboration that you have at Sky Press Books and in general in your institute. And I'm very pleased to see the publication of this book, Foundations of Vajrayana. Dr. Ben Joffe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.